for joining us here. This is the Kingston Peace Council's first ever event, and really honored to see faces I know, and really excited to see faces I don't know join us here for a talk with our guest, Dan Kovalik. Before we get going and hear from Dan, I thought that maybe it would be good to give a little bit of, to let you guys know, I guess, who we are, who the Canadian Peace Congress is, and why we're here today. So myself, John, Scott at the back, Jan, Rohit, and Sean, I think I've gotten everyone there. Yeah, we've all been involved in organizing the Kingston Peace Council over the last few months. It's been a pretty flawless process so far. We haven't run into any major conflict or anything like that, no sectarianism. So it's been very, very good and productive so far, and we hope that continues. Basically, what we're here to do is help increase public awareness about events going on around the world, connected to struggles here at home, talking about issues of militarization, problems with the environment and climate change, and a whole host of other issues. We are a member of the Canadian Peace Congress. We have Miguel Figueroa joining us, who is the president of the Canadian Peace Congress, here joining us today. This tour that Dan's going on goes from here to Ottawa tomorrow, back to Toronto, and then to Hamilton. So he's promoting his new book with, I don't know, perhaps with the assistance, I suppose, of the Canadian Peace Congress. Dan's got his new book, The Plot to Control the World, and he's going to discuss it here today. For those of you who don't know Dan Kovalik, he's internationally renowned. He's an author, he's a lawyer, and a peace activist. And he's here to talk about several issues, I imagine, especially with the latest happenings with Venezuela and everything that's going on there. And we're really, really excited to have him join us today. So hopefully that was a good enough introduction.
It was a great introduction. It was terrific.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for everyone coming. And I'm very honored that I'm your first guest speaker. I am going to focus a lot on Venezuela today. My book, just by the way, is about U.S. intervention throughout the world. Mostly since World War II, but I go back farther than that. And I'd like to open with a quote from Eduardo Galeano, who wrote Open Veins of Latin America, amongst other things. As Galeano said, that every time the U.S. saves a country, it turns it into either a mental institution or a cemetery. And I think that if you look at history, that is a largely true statement. And I think it needs to be kept in mind when we look at current attempts of the U.S. to intervene in countries like Venezuela. First of all, just a quick show of hands on some historical events. Who in the room has heard of the Tiananmen Square massacre? I see unanimous, right? Anyone tell me what year that was?
89?
89, okay, good. And how many people have heard of the Caracazo? No hands. Also took place in 1989. I think that the Caracazo, if you don't know about the Caracazo, you can't understand Chavez and Maduro and what's happening in Venezuela right now. So, real brief recounting. So the Tiananmen Square massacre, as you know, in that massacre, the Chinese military, or the provincial military, they believe killed between 300 and 3,000 people in that massacre. By the way, none of which took place in the square itself. But if you want to stump your friends, ask them how many people died in Tiananmen Square. The answer is none. But they died in the periphery. In any case, again, the estimate is about 300 to 3,000. It's one of those things where, killings happen in a lot of places and the numbers are greatly contested. Meanwhile, in the same year, in Venezuela, there was an uprising by people because there was an increase in the oil prices that people had to pay. Now, very much like what's happening in France right now with the yellow vest, which also, that movement erupted on essentially that straw that broke the camel's back. This was a straw that broke the camel's back for the poor of Venezuela. At this time, about 70% of Venezuela was living in poverty conditions. And the increase in the oil, amongst everything else they were going through, was just the last straw. They rose up in protest, and the Venezuelan security forces killed between about 300 and 3,000 people. Okay, similar numbers to Tiananmen Square. However, Venezuela is a country of 30 million people. China is a country of 1 billion. Right? Probably at that time a little less than 1 billion, but probably Venezuela probably less than 30 million. The point is, those numbers in Venezuela are much more catastrophic, right? The proportional amount of people killed is much higher in China. But why is it that we know about Tiananmen Square, we don't know about the Caracaza, right? And this goes back to something that I think Noam Chomsky, amongst others, has talked about over and over, and that I talk about in my book. It goes to the issue of worthy victims and unworthy victims. And so when we live in the West, we live in North America, what Chomsky would say, and Edward Herman, his co-writer, is that worthy victims are those, for example, in Tiananmen Square in China, who are killed by our rivals or our enemies. Okay, those are worthy victims. So we're going to focus on them in the news, almost to the exclusion of learning about the unworthy victims. And who are unworthy victims? Those who are killed by the United States itself and by its allies. Those people are not worthy of discussion, right? Because we're doing the killing. So best not to talk about those people at all. So for example, right now, if you're paying attention to the mainstream news, you might think that Venezuela is the most desperate country in the world in terms of human rights, humanitarian crisis, that's right. Because almost every day you're being barraged with news to that effect. Meanwhile, by far the greatest humanitarian crisis in the world is where right now? With it. Well, it might have been a bit ago, but not right now. Well, where is the worst bloodletting happening now? Yemen. So what you don't hear a lot about is Yemen. And what you certainly don't hear a lot about is the fact that the US and the UK are supporting the Saudi-Turkey shoot, and that's what it is. It is a one-sided war. You can barely call it a war. It's assault on Yemen. The UN has estimated that at least 12 million people will starve there because of this conflict. 12 million. Possibly 21 million. These are staggering figures. These are Holocaustal numbers. And yet you are not being barraged every day with information about this. And so what you have is this obsession on one country like Venezuela that is targeted for regime change. And that, as we know now, it's not a secret. It is being targeted for the regime change and has been really since Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998 and took office in 1999. So in fact, this they recently celebrated the 20th anniversary of his inauguration this year. Let me talk a little before I get directly to Venezuela and Chavez and Maduro. Back up a little bit to the national security doctrine, which John F. Kennedy, the great liberal, reminds me a lot of Trudeau, but handsome, young, liberal guy. He created the national security doctrine in 1962, which really is still in effect. And the national security doctrine despite its name, has nothing to do with national security. It had to do with attempting to prevent progressive social change in Latin America. And there were two things that led to him developing the national security doctrine. One was, of course, the Cuban Revolution in 1959. But the second thing was the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church in 1962, in which, as you know, many of you know, Pope John the 23rd began to popularize the church, made the vernacular the language of the church instead of Latin, and began to try to make the church what it had been for its first 300 years until it became the Church of the Holy Roman Empire, and that was the Church of the people. And as we know, and particularly in Latin America, particularly beginning in Brazil, this took the form of liberation theology. A doctrine which, in its own words, took a preferential treatment of the poor. The idea that Christ, was a person of the poor, called for us to take care of the poor, and that's what the church should do. This doctrine of liberation theology was incredibly concerning to the United States, because Latin America is mostly Roman Catholic. It was even more so then. And the concern was people would get crazy ideas that they could take their countries into their own hands, use their resources for themselves, and not allow their resources to be taken to enrich the United States and its corporations. And so the national security doctrine in 1962 was a doctrine to prevent popular movements and revolutions from breaking out in Latin America. And one of the architects of the national security doctrine was a guy named General William Yarborough, who was sent, his first country he was sent to was Colombia, South America. And here he unveiled the national security doctrine. And here he unveiled one of the key tactics of the national security doctrine, and that was paramilitary death squads. So his view, which was adopted by most of the U.S.'s allies in the region, was to use civilian forces as military forces, paramilitary forces, to carry out the dirty deeds that the U.S. did not want to be blamed for, or its allies. And what were these dirty deeds? Killing trade unionists, killing peasant leaders, killing Catholic priests who advocated for the poor, killing human rights leaders. And, of course, as we know, these death squads proliferated throughout Latin America, and did their job very well in murdering all of these people. Probably the most famous victim in terms of a liberation theologian or someone friendly with it who was killed was, of course, Archbishop Oscar Romero in San Salvador, who was killed in 1980 by U.S.-funded forces, a month after he wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter asking him to stop funding the repressive forces in El Salvador. Well, as some of you know, Romero was actually made a saint. He was declared a saint in October of this year. And so the U.S. was very much responsible for murdering a saint and actually making him martyr. But in any case, this is the background that we're dealing with when we're talking about the U.S. and Latin America. The idea that the U.S. is supporting democracy and human rights in Latin America has to be, it does not pass the laugh test, right? That it's a joke. Any idea that the U.S. would ever do such a thing, particularly a president like Donald Trump, cannot be taken seriously, and yet it is being taken seriously, including by liberals and people in the Trump resistance who on this issue support him, including many Democrats, right? And including, I believe, your own Prime Minister, Trudeau, who actually Fidel Castro held him in his arms as a baby. You might not know that. He's come a long way from there. Okay. So let's talk about then the nature of Venezuela and the Venezuelan Revolution. First of all, the Caracazo in 1989 really creates Hugo Chavez. It creates him as a human being, but also the movement that puts him into power. It was, not shockingly, a very traumatic experience for Venezuela, which led the Venezuelan people to want radical social change in their country. And the person who would lead this would be Hugo Chavez, who came from a very poor family. He always talked about being born in a mud hut, who was a military person, and who in 1994 attempted a coup in Venezuela to overthrow the government there. He was unsuccessful and he was put in jail for a time. He was eventually released, and he ran for president in 1998. And he was a dark horse candidate. He was not expected to win. One of the other candidates was like, I believe she had been like Miss Universe or something, but he ran against a supermodel, and incredibly he won the election. Shocked Venezuela, it shocked the world. And he immediately began some major changes in Venezuela. First of all, despite all the critiques of Chavez and Maduro, one of the main things he did, even putting aside the social reforms, was to democratize Venezuela. He created, or I should say, he allowed the people to create a new constitution. They set up a constitutional convention, which people from all around the country participated to help write, and then they held a referendum, a national referendum, to approve the Constitution. For the first time ever, the Constitution now recognized people who had not been recognized before. Indigenous people, people of African descent, who had been forgotten about, who were invisible people before this. But he also, in the Constitution, enshrined a very democratic system, which maybe some of you have seen. Jimmy Carter said they had the best electoral system in the world. And it's a system that allows for recall of the president. And in fact, Chavez himself stood for recall several times. Within a very short period of time, Chavez or his party or his policies were up for elections 15 times. It's a very brisk democratic system. In addition, with the help of other election experts, they created a very elegant electoral process, and I've been an election observer there about 6 times, including for both elections of Nicolas Maduro in 2013 and 2018, in which individuals go to the voting, it's set up like a horseshoe. You go to the first table and you have to present your fingerprint and put it on a machine, and it reads your fingerprint. If it doesn't show that you're a registered voter who hasn't voted yet, the machine doesn't turn on, and you show your voter ID in addition. Frankly, you'd think the Republicans would love this. They're trying to do that sort of thing all over the U.S. So first of all, it's a very reliable system because it made sure you're registered to vote, and 2, prevents you from voting. Once you do that, you then go to the next section, top of the horseshoe, and there's a little box there, gives you a little privacy, and there's a machine in the middle in which you vote electronically, and then that prints out a paper receipt that shows, hopefully, that the people you voted for, you did vote for, and show you voted for, and then you go to the bottom of the horseshoe again, and you put it in a box. Box is sealed up at the end of the election day. And by the end of the night, that night, 55%, or I should say, boxes in 55% of all polling places are audited to make sure the paper ballots meet up with the electronic vote. And the people who do that are the people from the different parties who send observers. The point is, It's a pretty foolproof process. You have an electronic system backed up by a paper ballot. And this is the system used throughout the country. Now, I don't know how it works in Canada, but in the US, every state has its own process. And so some are purely electronic. Some you might remember in Florida with the hanging chads in 2000, people had to mark these very opaque paper ballots. And the point is it's not uniform. In Venezuela, it's uniform and it's a very reliable system. The other thing that Chavez did was move for social reforms in Venezuela to help the poor. And year after year, until about 2014 or so, Venezuela was lauded for its ability to reduce poverty and extreme poverty by extreme percentages in Venezuela. Now, what happens in 2014? What I want to note essentially is that the policy, particularly of the U.S. towards Venezuela, has been one of trying to starve out the Venezuelan people and then blaming them for starving. Okay? So in 2014, several moves are made against Venezuela to stop this horrible process of democratization and social reform. One, and you can read a very good article about this from the Independent of London. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia, as they had done in the past, connived to artificially suppress oil prices by flooding the oil market. They did this primarily to undermine Russia and Iran, but as the Independent of London noted, it devastated Venezuela, which depends on oil for about 75% of its revenues. And so, one, you have this attack really on Venezuela's economic well-being beginning in 2014. In addition, around the same time, the U.S. begins a series of sanctions against Venezuela, again targeted towards undermining the Venezuelan economy. And the goal, by the way, of all these sanctions, and I think the U.S. has sanctions against like 35, 36 countries right now. By the way, they're all illegal because you can't use these types of, it's weapons against other people. These are economic weapons. Technically, you should go to the Security Council to do that. You can't just go and impose this against other countries. But of course, it never stops the U.S. But it begins to impose these sanctions, which do a number of things. First of all, the indirect result of the sanctions is that many companies dealing with Venezuela, either because they also want to undermine the government or because they're afraid that they're governed by the sanctions, begin to stop selling to Venezuela, stop selling medicine, stop selling food, even when they're paid for it, by the way. Venezuela would pay for shipments of this insulin, pay for shipments of food, pay for shipments of chemo for children, and never get the product sent to them, right? We have this happening right now. The Bank of England is holding $1.5 billion in Venezuelan gold that they deposited there, like you and I would deposit, money into a bank or maybe something into a bank deposit box. But England isn't giving it back. And the sanctions began to be ratcheted up to the point where they would not allow Citgo, Venezuela's oil company, to send back $1 billion a year to Venezuela. So Citgo would sell Venezuelan oil in the United States. And $1 billion of that was kept in the United States, a year, and could not be sent back. As the years go by, Trump begins to ratchet up these sanctions. A big thing he does is prevent Venezuela from going to international organizations to refinance its debt. So that the economic woes that's already beginning to pile up, it can't do what many countries do and reorganize their debt so that they're able to dig out of that economic crisis. Meanwhile, and as Miguel reminded me today at lunch, the U.S. prevailed on companies like Standard & Poor's, which rates both private and public institutions for creditworthiness, prevailed upon them to derank Venezuela, to lower their credit rating, which increases their debt by a certain, they have to pay more on the debt. You know how that works. The less you're able to pay, the more interest you have to pay. Very nice system we live on. One might think it could be the opposite, but we know if you borrow money or you have a credit card, the worse credit you have, the higher interest you pay. So this is what happened in Venezuela. So all these things conspire to cause great economic hardship in Venezuela, which makes the war against poverty, so to speak, more difficult. And certainly the gains of the revolution began to be rolled back. Now, Venezuela tried to do a number of things to counter this and to try to make sure people were getting what they needed. Some of these things worked, some did not. So one thing they did is subsidize food to make it cheaper for people to have food. Great idea. But what happened was, they have this very porous border with Colombia. People would go across to Colombia with subsidized food and make a profit on it. So they'd be taking food out the door. What also happened is private companies in Venezuela, which wanted to undermine the Bolivarian revolution of Chavez and Maduro, stockpiled food. So even though it was being subsidized and even though the food was there, it was not getting to market. And as I said, the same thing was happening with medicines. So that became very difficult. So then the other thing Venezuela began to do, they created this CLAP program in which they began to give food to people. And I've seen some of these CLAP places, and you go and you present a card and you get this big bag of food, and food that will last for a while, things like rice, dry beans, that sort of thing, oil, things that staples that you could use, which has helped, certainly, and that's expanded that program. The other thing that's expanded is actually growing food in Venezuela for consumption, because they found they couldn't import food very efficiently for the reasons I said. And so they began programs of trying to grow it a lot more themselves, and in a lot of that, they're giving away at low prices through this CLAP program. So they have tried to counter this. They've also done all sorts of things to the currency to try to stop inflation. And again, though, it's been a struggle. And there's certainly great economic hardship there. Though the interesting thing is that Maduro, if you look at the protests against Maduro and those for Maduro, you see a huge difference between who's in those protests. Right? Those protests against Maduro, the protesters tend to be whiter and wealthier. And those supporting Maduro tend to be darker skinned and poor. He still has a very strong base amongst the poor and amongst Afro-Venezuelans and indigenous, which I think should be kept in mind when people try to line up on one side of those or another. Meanwhile, in terms of social programs, what has continued, even through all of these problems, is subsidized housing for the poor. Up till now, Chavez and Maduro have built about 2.5 million homes, subsidized homes, for low-income people. 2.5 million. Quite significant. Venezuela, as I said, has about 30 million people. You figure an average family of 4 in a home, 4 times 2.5, it's 10 million. 10 million people housed out of 30 million. In very nice homes. I've been to these homes. It's not something to sneeze at. And so when people went to the polls last May, and again, I was there as an observer, they voted overwhelmingly for Maduro. And these were mostly lower income, poor, working class people. Now, how do I know this? Because, so first of all, some of the opposition, not all, but some of the opposition called for people not to vote at all. And so there was a large abstention from voting, as, by the way, there is in the US. But nonetheless. And it was fascinating because we'd go to a poorer neighborhood and see people lined up to vote. We go to a wealthier neighborhood and there was no one at the polls. So clearly there was abstention and it was along generally class lines. But in the end, 46% of the people came out to vote, 46% of the electorate. And of them, 67% voted for Nicolas Maduro. Meanwhile, he ran against a real alternative to him, a guy named Henry Falcone, who came from the business community, who wanted to dollarize the economy, who had very different notions of how to run the country. So people had a choice. A lot of people stayed home, but that's their choice too. The interesting part, again, when we look at the intentions of the US, for example, towards Venezuela, is that Trump tried to prevent Henry Falcone from running for president. He threatened Falcone with sanctions if he went forward with running for president. And the reason he did this is because he was more interested in totally delegitimizing the elections than he was in getting a more pro-US person in office, which tells you a lot. Falcone went ahead and ran anyway, and he lost. But in any case, this is all to say that this notion in the press that these were sham elections or that Nicolas Maduro does not have a legitimacy as a president is simply not true. And again, I'd like to point, especially being from the United States, which holds itself out as the beacon of democracy and freedom in the world. I'm sure that chafes you a lot. It would chafe me as well. But it's not true, right? It's not true. So first of all, the U.S. supports 73% of the world's dictatorships. Right? Meanwhile, at home, it's not democratic. In 2016, 1 million people were wrongly taken off the voter rolls in the United States, mostly African Americans. In states like North Carolina, we know there was massive fraud that's been exposed, ballots destroyed, that sort of thing. The point is, we are hardly a democratic country. Meanwhile, under our while it was constitutional, my president, Donald J. Trump, is now president, even though he got about 3 million less votes than Hillary Clinton under our bizarre electoral system. The point is, there's a huge question whether Trump has any legitimacy as president, or George W. Bush, who was made president by the Supreme Court, right? We can all find foibles in our own electoral systems. And the notion that then, notwithstanding all that, the U.S. can then say, okay, we're going to just support this guy who declared himself president, who never even ran for president, this white hat character, should be offensive to people. I mean, this is not democracy. As was pointed out in the Toronto Star this morning by, what's her name, Leslie?
Linda McQuaid.
Linda McQuaid.
McQuaid.
In a very excellent piece. She said it would be tantamount to Trudeau recognizing Nancy Pelosi president of the United States, right? Even though I don't like Trump, I would find this very odd, indeed. And it's analogous to what's happening in Venezuela. Meanwhile, there have been some polls, very reliable polls taken in Venezuela recently. Over 80% of the people polled in Venezuela, 1, oppose U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and 2, over 80% oppose sanctions against Venezuela. So if we care about the will of Venezuela, I would think those polls would tell us all we needed to know, and that is that we need to end these threats against Venezuela's sovereignty, including military threats. I teach international human rights, amongst other hats I wear, and one thing I teach is a way high up in the charter of the United Nations is Article 2.4 that says that even the threat of force against another country is against international law, and Trump has made explicit threats, military threats against Venezuela. We need to recognize Maduro as the president there, and we need to end these sanctions by the United States, by Canada, by Great Britain and others, which are, one, as I noted, illegal, but which are also making it impossible for Venezuela to have a thriving economic system. I understand, for example, now that Trudeau has suggested maybe giving some humanitarian aid to Venezuela in the amount of like $50 million, right? Well, first of all, how far is that going to go? You send a couple trucks of food. How long is that going to last anywhere? But also, the sanctions against Venezuela costed $20 billion last year alone, $20 billion with a B. So you're going to take $20 billion from them and give them $50 billion. It's a joke. It's not real. And we have to see beyond these claims to understand that. I actually like a lot I'll just end with, I love the Scooby-Doo cartoon over there, which talks about I guess the guy who turns out to be the killer of the story, posing as human rights, but they take off his mask, and it's imperialism, right? And to me, that is the lesson that we need to learn. This idea, again, using my own reference as someone in the U.S., the idea that the 82nd Airborne is a human rights organization is a joke. It's not a serious proposition. And yet people believe it. And again, I would refer to you a great book, beyond the book that I wrote. A book that I love is by a physicist, actually. I find the people who write the best on this aren't in the area of expertise. Chomsky's a linguist, and this guy's a physicist. He wrote a book called Humanitarian Imperialism, and it's about 100 pages. It's a quick read, but it's brilliant. And his point, which I wholeheartedly endorse and agree with, is the best you can do for human rights, for humanitarian law, for peace, is to oppose your country's military intervention in other countries, right? The best thing you can do for the world right now, just in terms of numbers, right? Stop the support of Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. Very simple. If you care about saving as many lives as possible, that's where you should put your efforts. You should put your efforts at ending the wars in Afghanistan, getting troops out of Syria, getting troops out of Iraq, stopping the war with Iran, stopping intervention in countries like Venezuela. The fixation should not be on the opposite, which it tends to be, which is where should we intervene next to bring human rights? Because we never bring human rights. Again, like the cartoon suggests, we come in with bags of things that say human rights, and we dump it out, and it's a bunch of skulls. We bring destruction to everywhere we intervene. Going back to the Galliano quote. And if we start with that premise, it's pretty easy to know what our job is. I'll end with one last other point that Britt Mott makes, which again I think is brilliant. The other thing we do, and Chomsky, of course, points that out all the time, I think we have a tendency, we certainly do as human beings, as individuals. It's always, as the Bible would say, it's easier to pick out the speck in your brother's eye when you have a plank in your eye, right? It makes us feel better when we can say, I'm better than that guy, right? At least I don't kill him, right, or whatever. And as countries, we do the same thing. And so we focus on the crimes and the evils of others much more than we do our own crimes, even though, in my view, they're much greater. And the analogy that I think Rick Monk gives, which is brilliant, is that such a view or such a perspective is so wrong-headed in part because it's also worthless. You know, I live in the U.S., so probably the best thing I can do is try to get my own government to do right? In my view, stop interventions. I can't, for example, stop what China's going to do. That's up to the Chinese people, you know. And so this, Britt Monk gives an example. You know, someone riding around in the U.S., say in Pittsburgh where I live, with a bumper sticker that says "Save Tibet," right? Well, who's your audience? Is there anyone in town that can do anything about it? Right? No, of course not. It may make you feel good, but it doesn't do anything. You know, so again, I think charity begins at home. And at home, we need to stop our own countries from making war on everyone else. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.
So we will have time for questions, but first, I'd like to first give a shout out to Red Toronto for sharing our page live. There's an audience of about 14 or 15,000 people there, so hopefully that gets picked up.
Nice.
Not saying that many will tune in,
Right,
but we
fair
can
enough.
hope, right? So thank you, Red Toronto. But now I'd like to bring up Miguel. He's the president of the Canadian Peace Congress. He's put a lot of effort into organizing this tour, and he's here to talk a little bit about the Kingston Peace Council and the Canadian Peace Congress at large. So.
Yeah, okay. So, hi everybody. Nice to be back in Kingston. I haven't been here for a while, but yes, I am the president of the Peace Congress, but really, the next few days I'm basically Dan's chauffeur driving around Southern Ontario, which is all good. And I have only one job today, and that is to shake you down, right? To make a pitch. People sometimes ask, well, when you have these events, why don't you just have a admission fee or something like that, And but the Peace Congress, we never do that, and there's a number of reasons we don't do it. Sometimes the venue itself doesn't, permit that sort of thing, including university venues and so on. But also because it's we want to be as inclusive as possible. We want people to come and share ideas, and discuss, and learn, and build something. And we don't want to base it on those people who have the ability to pay. Those people who have resources to contribute, but we want to involve everybody. But there's another reason, personally anyway, why I don't like the idea of admission fees. Because it's like putting a price tag on things. It's like commodifying ideas. And if anything about this system that is really remarkably good at is turning everything into a commodity, right? So you go to a talk and then it's like buying a ticket to go see a movie. At the end of the movie you say, well, was that worth the like $18 or $15 I paid to get into the movie and so on? Well, I was thinking about this question of commodification. Not just commodities per se, and services, ideas are now commodified, culture is commodified, even body parts in many parts of the world are commodified. Our water is becoming commodified, even in Canada, with the greatest amount of fresh water in the world. Pretty soon our air will be commodified and what have you. Well, that's not what we're about. That's not the kind of world that we would want to see. And that's one of the things about the Peace Congress, because we're an organization that doesn't only fight for peace in a narrow sense, in the sense of the absence of war. We think peace is a lot more than the absence of war. And that's why we always connect up the question of peace with social justice, with a real struggle for democratization and independence and equality of nations around the world. And you can't have equality of nations when you have circumstances where the sovereignty of nations can be trampled upon by the powerful. And we see that happening over and over and over again around the world. And it's a very dangerous, dark time that we've entered into. You think about not only the wars that are raging, but the militarization that is taking place, and the drive to increase and expand the arms race, the proliferation of foreign military bases around the world, all of these kinds of things. Very scary. What to do about it? Well, we need to start by looking at our own country. Don't we have a view about Canada? Many of us, particularly from the older generation, I guess, think about Canada as being like, peace, peacekeeping kind of nation, and being balanced and rational, and so on and so forth. And the sad truth, of course, is that Canadian foreign policy, particularly in the last few years, has really turned in a very dangerous direction. And Canada more and more is supporting not only this war on Venezuela, and even though there's not foreign troops on the ground yet, as Dan spoke very eloquently to, it is a war. It's an economic war, it's a diplomatic war, it's an ideological war, where there's one message, one discourse in the mass media, and that's the only voice really that Canadians are hearing. Even on our public broadcaster on CBC, it's really disturbing the way, the kind of coverage that, and that's a source of information that Canadians are basing on. That's the news that we have to decide what and try to understand the world as it's evolving. And it's very disturbing, and it's a reflection not only of Canadian foreign policy in Venezuela and in Latin America, but also in the Middle East. Dan talked about the situation in Yemen. So here is an incredible, as you say, it's not even a war, it's a turkey shoot. It's a vicious onslaught by Saudi Arabia. But has the Canadian government said we should impose sanctions on Saudi Arabia? Which, by the way, is a real dictatorship by any measure. Have we withdrawn our ambassador? Have we even sent a diplomatic note of criticism? No. Why? Because we have a $15 billion contract to sell Saudi Arabia these armored vehicles. So there's money at stake. And by the way, there's big money at stake in Venezuela as well. Of course, that's the gold and that's the oil. So a lot of the talk that we hear here about humanitarian concerns and wanting to bring democracy to the Venezuelan people is a smokescreen. In many respects, in the States, they're far more honest. John Bolton was on the news a few days ago where he said it's about the oil. And we have already plans to move in to develop the oil resources by American companies and so on. This new pretender to the throne, this new faker, Guaido, just yesterday it was announced that he, of course, is now the head of state, or the self-proclaimed head of state, has just fired all of the directors of Citgo. And he's installed, did you see this?
I did see it.
5 new directors of Citgo. All 5 of them live in the United States. 4 of them are Venezuelans, but living in the United States. And the 5th one is actually an American. So there's now going to be an American on the board of Citgo. It's bogus, it will never happen. But it shows you really, in fact, that he's playing a role as a front person, really for a drive which at its essence is economic imperialism. And Canada's part of it through the Lima Group. It's really shameful. Canadians should really be bloody angry about it. So there's a lot of important issues that need to be addressed in the peace movement. This year is the 70th anniversary of NATO. And we think in the Peace Congress that it's about time that we start talking about the elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about, which is what is Canada doing in this aggressive military alliance? There's no Soviet Union anymore. And yet NATO is actually growing and growing. They just brought Colombia in
Right.
as a partner to NATO. moving closer and closer to the Russian border, even though they promised back in the early 90s not to do that, not to move 1 inch further than the German border. They're now right on the very borders of the Russian Federation. The government has announced that they're increasing military spending in Canada by 73% over the next 10 years. 73%. Well, services for people, for Aboriginal peoples in this country, for working people who want a decent wage, decent minimum wage, for migrant workers, for new immigrants to this country, a lot of services for the elderly, our healthcare system, our educational system, and so on.
Healthcare, affordable housing.
Absolutely, affordable housing. All of these things are being cut back, and yet we're expanding military spending billions of dollars on frigates, on F-35 fighter jets, and so on. And all of that is connected to our membership in NATO. All of it's connected to it. If Canada was to withdraw from NATO tomorrow, we could easily cut the military budget in this country by 75%. No, the budget this year is $20 billion. So that's $15 billion that could be put towards universal health care, child care in this country. Not to mention our healthcare system and so many other, but burning needs of the Canadian people. And it would make the world a much more peaceful place, or at least Canada's role in the world as a force for peace and disarmament. We're going to have a federal election this year in October. And I'll tell you something. The parties will be debating the carbon tax, they'll be debating this and that, and so on and so forth. But the one issue that they won't really be debating is Canada's foreign policy and defense policy. And the sad reason for that is that most of the parties in Parliament kind of agreed. They support the increase in military spending. They bicker about how much it is, and it should be more, it should be less. But one of the things that we want to do with the Peace Congress is make sure that the issue of peace and disarmament and Canada's foreign policy, not supporting regime change, not supporting militarization and war, but rather foreign policy for peace and for disarmament, that those are the issues that really should be debated in this coming federal election. And there's a lot of other peace organizations in the country that feel the same way. And so we're calling for, we just put out a unity appeal to peace and solidarity groups and other labor, other people's organizations, the Indigenous peoples movement, women's movement, and so on, to work together to make sure that a people's agenda is put forward in this federal election. And that we put all of the parties, put all of their feet to the fire to justify their positions and to try to build up a constituency for peace, to strengthen the peace movement in this country. Because the sad reality is that we're far too weak compared to the growing dangers that exist in the world. We think back to the 80s, the peace movement in the 80s, even at the time of the Iraq War in 2003, the peace movement today is not anywhere near capable of addressing these concerns. We don't moan and groan about it, but we need to turn it around. And part of it is to build this movement. So I'm going to end my long pitch by saying that I want to appeal to those of you who can to help us not only cover the costs of Dan's visit here to Southern Ontario, the flights and the gas and all that sort of stuff, which isn't cheap, but also to help to build our movement, to help the work of the Peace Congress and the Kingston Peace Council right here. We're so happy. This is what the Kingston Council is one of our newest members. I think in Halifax as well. I think one of the two new affiliates of the Peace Congress to help build our movement and help to build really a fight back for peace. Sounds like a counterintuitive turn of phrase, but it really is a fight. It really is a struggle. And right now, only one side is fighting. The militarists are fighting. We need to unite and mobilize all of the voices for peace to turn that situation around. So I didn't bring a hat, but I see a hat right there. Could we circulate that hat, and could I certainly appeal to you to be as helpful and as generous as you can? Thank you very much.
So yeah, thank you, Miguel. So we have about 15, 20 minutes left, I think. Maybe about 25. So we have lots of time, I think, for questions.
And discussion.
And discussion. So if no one has an immediate question as we're all passing the hat, which Sean does, okay, so maybe we'll start there. And I got a question for you, Dan, right after that. So Sean, take it away.
So I don't know necessarily for anybody in this room, because I think we're probably here because we're already receptive to these messages. But in terms of our conversations, if we're thinking individually about how to bring people on board, particularly progressive people, if you're not familiar with the full dynamics of how this has played out in Canada with Venezuela, the biggest thing is that all of the progressives in the country have just, shut up or totally pivoted right on this issue.
Yeah, I know that.
And I think what I see is that the dialogue that's being directed around this issue, both, dialogue in mainstream media and as individuals, we're talking about the Maduro government as though it just magically one day showed up in place and the Bolivarian revolution is not understood. And that forget Maduro, forget what his strengths and weaknesses are, his goods and his bads, as well as the regime around him and the bureaucracy, which is, a big issue as to why Venezuela, what the faults are within Venezuela, why they've made bad decisions. There is a movement of people underneath that isn't going to go away just because Guaido gets elected. And that they're not going to just shut up and go back home, and that their interests are specifically, against the interests of other groups in the country, as we have competing interests in any democracy. But I think I'm just kind of curious what do you think is the missing piece? What's not being discussed in this issue when it comes to the Maduro government and what its faults are and are not? What should media be looking at in the country?
Yeah, those are very good questions. And obviously, it's true. I mean, the Maduro government, as any government, has had missteps. A lot of their financial maneuvers to try to get out of this crisis have not worked. Sometimes they made them worse. I think they were done in good faith, but again, they made mistakes. I think, first of all, again, the idea that you would overthrow another government because they've made mistakes, especially under incredible duress by these sanctions, is without warrant. I think you also have to, again, look at where Venezuela was when Chavez came to power, as opposed to comparing Venezuela, say, to the United States or something. That you have to put it in historical context. And I think that you have seen in the last 20 years a great advancement for women's rights, for indigenous rights, again, for Afro-Venezuelan rights. And those people are the people coming to bat for Maduro. Again, I think you have to focus on who is this opposition and who are the people who's the base of Maduro. And it tends to be people that we, at least as progressives, support. So I think that is a big focus. And again, I think the other problem is, well, there's this guy, Alfred de Zayas. I don't know if you've been seeing his interviews. He was a UN expert up until recently, and he went to Venezuela and did a study on the humanitarian issues there. And I don't say humanitarian crisis because his conclusion was there was not a humanitarian crisis, even though there were problems. But his other conclusion, and he's going around talking to whoever will talk to him about it, is that it's been the sanctions that have been the greatest contributor and cause of the economic woes of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people. And so I think that has to be focused on. Like, whatever mistakes Maduro has made, we have to focus on the role that the U.S. and other countries' sanctions has had on that country, that is what has largely caused the suffering there. So we'll never know what could have happened, of course, in recent years had those sanctions not been imposed. You know, and again, this idea, to me, criticizing Maduro for the economic problems is very much like blaming an abuse victim for being abused and saying, well, you could have done this, you could have done that, you could have, you know, protected yourself more, but you know, whatever. Well, that's not the point. The point is there's an abuser that's abusing that person. And that's the same thing that's happening in Venezuela. And I think the victim is the one that's being blamed. And I think the other thing, we have to look at antecedents and other historical situations like this and what happened. First of all, in looking at the nature of the opposition, we have to see what did they do when they took power for a couple of days in 2002 with the U.S. help. So you remember there was a coup in 2002. Hugo Chavez, the sitting president, was kidnapped by rogue members of the military, taken to an island, and the opposition declared itself the leadership of Venezuela. What did they do when they had the chance? They threw out the Constitution. You can see a video of this. Actually, a great video to watch is "The Revolution Will Not Be Televised" about these events. I tell you, they correct them. Guy goes on TV. We're throwing out the Constitution. Disbanding the Supreme Court, disbanding the National Assembly, fires the Attorney General. Every democratic institution they shut down immediately. This was democracy for the opposition. And the U.S. immediately recognized it. One of the few governments in the world. And of course, as we know, what happened was the poor came down from the mountains, from the barrios, and they called for Chavez to be returned. He was returned. Actually, it's very biblical. As you know, I make a lot of biblical references. I was raised Catholic. So he was taken hostage on Good Friday, 2002. He was returned on Easter Sunday. So very interesting symbolism here. The point is, this is not a democratic opposition. They've shown their hand. And if we look at another antecedent, what happened in Chile, when a very similar situation, Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1973, and his government was undermined by economic war against him that the U.S. waged against it, with the help, by the way, of U.S. unions, but that's another subject for another day. As we know, when he was overthrown, the presidential palace was bombed by their military. He was killed, 3,000 others were killed, and about 30,000 people were tortured. That was a government that had been in place for 3 years. You have a government in Venezuela that's been in place for 20 years. The bloodletting that will happen, I can guarantee, if this opposition comes to power, particularly through a coup, which is what's happened right now, the bloodletting will be worse than that. To unroot that 20-year revolution with all the support it has, it's going to be very ugly. And that's what people, again, have to think about, is what's the alternative? What alternative vision does the U.S. and Canada have for Venezuela? Well, we know exactly from what Miguel said. It's to take their oil, not to be used for them, not to be used for building homes and buying food. No. It's to put profits in the pockets of people who live in the United States and Canada. So we have to be honest about that. You know, what is the alternative? Even if we look at Libya, again, the great Saint Obama, you know, he attacked Libya again in defense of human rights, based on 3 lies, which were big lies. One of which I'll just mention because it became very important later. Is they claimed that Gaddafi was using black African mercenaries to attack the population. And they said you could tell these mercenaries by their yellow hard hats. Yeah, because they weren't mercenaries, they were construction workers. Gaddafi invited into the country. Well, Amnesty International eventually, which helped prime the machine for the war, eventually says, oh, well, there weren't any black mercenaries. They were just black migrant workers. Well, but this big lie, which helped prime the war in Libya, also had the result of when the insurgents the US and NATO were supporting took power. They engaged in genocide against black Africans living in Libya. The US claimed, and ironically, with one of the leaders being Samantha Power, who won a Pulitzer for her book, Decrying Crimes of Genocide. We go in claiming we're going to stop the genocide. No, NATO paved the way for a genocide. Black towns were depopulated. Black Libyans were put in jail. They were killed. Now they're being sold on the street as slaves. And that's a fact. That is not a controversial statement. That is what humanitarian intervention looks like. That is the next step. And again, I think that's what we have to focus on. What is the future for Venezuela if the U.S. gets its way? It ain't, rainbows and gumdrops.
And just to finish the thought, I think that the other criticism coming both from people on the left and people who kind of say this cynically at the left is, well, these aren't all angels. Maybe they're not, but let's look at Iraq. The regime that was changed was an awful regime, and many of the people involved there were awful people. But you think that they're just going to pack up their bags and go because you've decided that there's a new regime in town? What we know about the Iraqi officers that were part of the Saddam regime is that many of those officers ended up working for ISIS.
Right.
And they have no ideology. There's not an ideological straight line between Saddam Hussein and ISIS, and often it's quite the opposite. They just are looking for their next thing. They're looking for revenge, and they're just like all of us. And in many cases, people are being backed into a corner in these types of invasions, and it's, they're not, what are they going to do? Go off to jail for the rest of their life? Or are they going to fight a bloody war and entrench? And like you're saying, you look at Saddam Hussein, that was certainly a 20-year regime. A 20-year regime in Venezuela, you're talking about trying to take people who have achieved something, whether through moral and good means or immoral and bad means. You're taking these people who have achieved something, and you're taking it all away from them and thinking that you can do that with democracy and also at the end of the barrel. It doesn't compute.
It doesn't compute. There's something very racist and condescending about it. Again, talking about going back to Jean Brugman, as he mentioned, humanitarian interventions like the Mississippi River, it only flows from north to south, not the other way. Right? If Venezuela were saying, Trump, you're not an angel, and we need to get, people would think that's a joke, right? But we feel like we can decide who the angels and the devils are in the world. And that's the problem. That really is the problem, that type of hubris. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of look forward a little bit and ask about the role between organized labor, different people who, for one reason or another, might want to join a peace movement, and the options that we have moving forward to actually create a peace movement that accomplishes a goal that we have in mind. So I think, you can look throughout history and see that labor, particularly through strikes, has had a pretty effective role in reeling in governments, and in some cases, going back to I guess maybe the best example in the Soviet Union, actually toppling a previous government. But building on that, I'd like to sort of hear your thoughts about what are things that peace activists can do to join hands with unions. And I think recently in Canada, we've seen at least 2 unions step forward, CUPE and CUPW, denounce Canada's role in regime change, which is all well and good. But what can we actually do beyond that to put pressure on the government to make sure that they do step down back off of their abhorrent goals of overthrowing different regimes around the world?
Yeah, well, that is the $64,000 question, for sure. I think, again, there is historical precedent for the fact that mass demonstrations can work to do that. I think you have a prime minister in Justin Trudeau who would be very sensitive to a mass opposition to his policy in Venezuela. I think he wants to look like the good guy. and he wants to look like the nice guy, right? And I think it is a matter of changing people's minds, and it's not something you can do overnight, but it is a matter of rallying people to the idea that this type of intervention is illegal and it's immoral, and getting people to oppose it by protesting. Again, unions can get people out in large numbers to do that, but also, writing letters to the editor, doing work on social media. It really is a very ideological battle we're fighting. And we have to win that battle and convince people this is not the right way to go. And that's a hard thing to do, but that's what the work is. I mean, that's why I'm here. I'm not making any money on this. I'll probably lose money on this store. But the main thing is I'm here to build peace. That's what I want to do. I actually just retired from my paying job so I could do this full time, and sometimes things can change almost overnight. We may put those efforts in. Chomsky always talks about the beginning of the opposition to the Vietnam War. He said, there'd be 5 of us in a church. One would be the priest and one would be the janitor. Yes. And then it became massive. So, I think you got to aim towards things, and there are a couple demonstrations coming up, right?
There are February 23rd. There's a big movement right across North America for rallies and protests on February 23rd. Something can be done here in Kingston would be great. But not just a question of protests or marches. There's lots of things that could be done. You could have a film night. There's so many resources on the net now. Videos about the truth of what's really happening in Venezuela. And you can download those, put them together, and have a really good film night. You could have a kind of a kitchen parties where people get together and write letters. It's important because there's one-way traffic everywhere. But now there's starting to appear in the media some pushback. And so, and we need to kind of build upon that. So every letter that's written, especially to the local newspapers, the Kingston Standard, right? Would be useful. And handwritten letters, by the way, are even more effective.
They say that than emails or phone calls.
Yeah, or to your local MPs and whatnot, the local backbenchers or whoever, But there's lots of things that could be done. On March 16th is another call for another mass action, and I was at a Venezuela Solidarity meeting just a few days ago in Toronto, and there's a proposal now between maybe Kingston as well. Why not? Because Kingston's very close to Ottawa. From Montreal, from Toronto, from Kingston, from other sectors in Southern Ontario, to converge on Ottawa and have a major demonstration there. So, sometimes it's better to do things locally, but sometimes it's also good to have a real presence in Ottawa. So there's a proposal to do that on March 16th. And on March 30th, I mentioned the question of NATO. There's a big move to have a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C., because the NATO summit and the NATO celebrations for 70 years of keeping peace and all this sort of stuff is happening. Foreign ministers are going to Washington, D.C. to have this gala celebration of how great NATO is. Well, there is going to be a big, massive demonstration, counter-demonstration, counter-conferences, a whole week of activities starting on March 30th and leading right up to April 4th, which is the anniversary of the foundation of NATO 70 years ago. And there's going to be actions across Canada as well, in Regina and Vancouver in Winnipeg, in Toronto, Montreal. But we want to see them in as many communities as possible. So there's March 30th, there's March 16th, and there's very soon, basically, a week and a bit from today, February 23rd.
And then also, and then I think, was there a hand up back there? Yeah. Oh. The other thing to do is to go to Venezuela. Go to places like Venezuela, go to Cuba, go to Nicaragua. on delegations and come back and tell what you see. I mean, it's very important to do that. We used to have a term, you don't hear about it much, but called accompaniment. I don't know if that's a term that's used. And maybe it's not even Canadian. Accompaniment. And the idea, there's a lot of examples of this. Actually, the one most interesting, I'd say, for example, Albert Schindler did accompaniment work, and John Revy in China during World War II. But the way I learned about it was in the 80s. People did accompaniment work in countries like Central America, where the U.S. was waging a brutal war, and people from North America and Europe would go to these countries, and still do, by the way. Some never left. And by their very presence paid witness to what was happening, and frankly, by their own presence could even deter violence against people there. And you go to countries that are being targeted for attack and saying, I don't accept that. And I'm going to go to Venezuela, and I'm going to speak out against this, and that can have a huge impact, not only back home, but frankly for the Venezuelan people. I can't tell you what kind of love you get back from these experiences, if I can say, be a little Pollyannish, but it is Valentine's Day, I suppose. Love. I mean, the greatest experiences I've had are in places like Nicaragua in the 80s during the war, or in Venezuela, or Iran. I was there in 2017. And the love that people have that you're there from these countries that are threatening them, and you're here to resist that, and you oppose that. Just the feeling that you get from that is incredible. Anyway, I would say definitely do that. Yes. No.
Do we have any more questions, Rohit? And then, yeah, for sure. So a couple more.
Do you believe that Maduro has the options to survive?
I mean, the answer is I don't know the answer. I think he has a huge row to hoe at this point. Now the latest sanctions, I mean, basically is they want to cut off any oil revenue that he can get from the United States. And that's still his biggest partner, purchaser of oil. They're trying to destroy that economy, frankly, beyond repair. Can he weather that? I don't know. Though, the Bolivarian Revolution has shown a great amount of resilience in the face, again, of really 20 years of opposition to them, which included the 2002 coup, which included a manager's strike of the oil fields and these sanctions. And he's weathered this storm that's just been brought upon him pretty well as well. So I think that he can do it, but I think that remains a question, because I think incredible pressure has been brought to bear. Yeah.
Talking about Russia and China and their relationship with all of this. Whether it
Well, they can certainly.
depend on the extent to which they can get buy things from China, from Russia, but especially China. They depend on the extent to which the aid they're receiving from China and Russia gets expanded.
Well, that's very true. And whether China will make up for the oil that the U.S. is, by the way, willing to buy, just not allow them to take the money from Iran, which is incredible. Again, whether China can make up for that. That's right, and that's why it's important to have a unipolar world. That it's important to have countries, frankly, that aren't siding with the United States, because.
And Turkey is increasing their purchases of Venezuelan oil as well.
So there is some hope in all of that. Yeah.
So in the beginning of your talk, you spoke about the role that the church and liberation theology played in the development of a particular political consciousness. So I was wondering, how is that currently implicated, I'd say, in Venezuela, and also more importantly, maybe Brazil with Bolsonaro?
Well, it's a great question. The answer is that largely liberation theology is dead. And it is thanks to, one, the Vatican, which quickly moved after John the 23rd died.
Paul VI killed it.
Paul VI killed it. He was a fascist, by the way. He was did some nasty stuff during the war. But the Vatican helped kill it through censure, defrocking priests, in the U.S., as the U.S. Army School of the Americas has stated on its website. It took credit itself for destroying liberation theology, and it did it through murder. Hundreds of priests were killed throughout Latin America. In Colombia alone, since 1984, 80 Catholic priests were killed, 3 bishops. Again, if that happened in Cuba, Cuba'd be vaporized, right? It's incredible. So these killings continue. The point is, there's not much left of the Liberation Church. And so most of what's left in Latin America is the old-time conservative church who align themselves with the aristocracy. And that was true in the 2002 coup. You know, you saw the main players, again, if you see this movie, you see the main players there, and one prominent, you know, I think the bishop or big prominent person in the church was there supporting the opposition. So, yeah, most of that liberation theology, including Brazil, have been destroyed. By the way, as Chomsky points out, and very few people know this, a lot of people know that the U.S. supported a military coup in Brazil in 1964. And what few people know is that one of the big reasons it did that was to wipe out liberation theology at its source, to kill the baby in its crib, which was Brazil. Yeah, so it is not the force it once was. There still are some liberation priests, you know, out and about. Very close to a guy named Father Javier Geraldo in Colombia, who still carries that mantle. He's about 80 years old and has written some amazing stuff on Colombia, for example. But they're very few and far between at this point.
Are there any more questions before we wrap up? Yeah, Janet.
I was thinking of, you know, 2002 coup attempt against Chavez, and the major reason why that coup was defeated was the power of the people, right? I mean, like more than like 1 million people basically took to the streets in Caracas, and he was held hostage, and at the end of the demonstration, he was basically brought back to where he belonged. So the chances of Maduro kind of resisting another coup attempt, I think, is related with the resistance of the people themselves. And maybe the previous comment that you made about maybe bureaucracy, etc. Unfortunately, like maybe since 2014, when the oil prices started to plummet and Venezuelan, you know, like revenues shrank, which also brought about policies, economic policies, created a greater rift between the bureaucracy and the people, ordinary people themselves, makes it a bit more difficult now.
Certainly.
They're still coming out in the streets though.
Yeah.
They've had massive rallies in Caracas and other centers, and none of it gets on the national news.
It is incredible.
None of it.
How one-sided it is.
Yeah, like
It's unbelievable.
I was gonna say that, you know, like with Chavez, he seemed to be relying on the power of people more than relying on like maybe composition of generals in the army.
Sure.
With Maduro, there is, I think, more weight given to that kind of balances within the army or the state. So maybe a more people-oriented politics might help, of course, with the international anti-imperialist, you know, that struggle. So I told it's important to have people on the ground. Otherwise, it's not possible. I mean, that's how democracies with progressive edge can survive, right?
Yeah, well, I do. I think you're right. That it's primarily up to the Venezuelan people, and it's also up to us whether we can get numbers out to support them. So yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly great hope, and I think there's a lot at stake. I mean, I can't emphasize that, not just for the Venezuela, but for the rest of the region. I'll just end with, you know, Chomsky, who could be very critical, by the way, of leftist governments, more so than I agree with, but whatever. He said upon Chavez's death that Chavez had brought a liberation to Latin America after 500 years of you know, Spanish in the U.S. intervention, that Chavez had helped liberate Latin America from that. I mean, it's a huge accomplishment. And it's an accomplishment the U.S. has wanted to wipe out and wants to wipe it out. And that's why we have to defend it. I mean, because where goes Venezuela will go most of Latin America. Cuba will be in deep trouble. And Nicaragua. Yeah.
We have to recognize also though, that the setbacks are not just Venezuela. Brazil.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, Honduras,
And-
basically a coup there.
And El Salvador, the right wing just elected the president, wiped out the FMLN. So it's not just, and Colombia elected their president. So the whole region and what they've done in Argentina, we're looking at a pretty widespread challenge to progressive.
They want to
Right.
complete that.
It's a
That's why they
rollout,
call it
yeah.
The troika of tyranny. So now the last remaining, well, Bolivia as well, but they refer to Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba.
Yeah.
You know?
And by the way, and I guess I'll just make a plug again for the book, I mentioned in here, I talk about what happened in Brazil. So the interesting thing, again, everyone's talking about, oh, democracy, and there's sham elections and everything in Venezuela. In Brazil, Bolsonaro was just elected because the most popular politician in Brazil, one of the most popular politicians in the world, was rotting in jail, Lula da Silva. And as I talk about and document in my book, The U.S., I'll put him there. So the idea that that wasn't a sham election is incredible. Had Lula run for president, he would have gotten 80% of the vote. Now, what is Bolsonaro, our buddy, doing? He is now invading the rainforest and attacking the indigenous, as he promised to do, to open it up for mining. Where's the call for intervention there?
Especially if we can.
Yeah, exactly. And I talk about the coup in Honduras as well, which the U.S. helped orchestrate in a very real and specific way. And again, where there's been horrible effects there. And again, when is the last time you heard about Honduras? I mean, it's incredible. The two things that happen when a country is targeted for regime change, not only is the coverage totally one-sided, right? So of the 6 million people who voted for Maduro, you never hear one on the news. But two, it's obsessive. Again, given the impression that Venezuela, for example, is some unique evil in the world. Because we never hear about its next door neighbor, Colombia, that has more internally displaced people than any country in the world at over 7 million people. Where 150 social leaders have been murdered by the state in the last year. That's Colombia. That's next door to Venezuela. When's the last time you heard about that in the news? Right? Our buddy, now a partner in NATO. This selective obsession with the countries that are marked for regime change is incredible. And again, we need to talk about those other cases. Okay, why don't we wrap up? And I do have some books for sale for 20 quid. Do you say quid in Canada?
No.
Okay. I love quid. And by the way, I'm selling it at loss because my publisher is in the middle of 2 different distributors. Long and short of it, I bought it for retail. I'm going to sell it below retail, $20 Canadian, and I'll sign it for you. Thank you.
And we have a sign-up sheet.
Yeah, so
Please put your names, if you like to be, informed of what the peace conference is doing, there's a sign-up sheet.
And please, if you can, sign up on the sheet. We would really appreciate it. Also, please follow us on Facebook, on Twitter. Our information's right there. And we don't have a date announced yet, but please stay tuned. We want to do a workshop talking about imperialism, what it is, and help educate, from a pedagogical perspective, educating the people who are going to organize with us so that we can move forward and create a meaningful resistance. And in order to do that, we need you to sign up on the sheet so that we can stay in touch. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks again to the Council. We appreciate you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
It's a lot of fun. Good. Hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, it's great. So we live stream.
Right.
If you can share that.
Oh, yeah, I will.
Yeah, that would be great.
Absolutely. Can you tag me in it, or I'll
No,
just find you?
You know, Canadian or Kingston Peace Council is where our case is.
Okay.
So it's an open public stage, so if you want to share that.
I will.
Awesome, thanks so much.
Sure, thank you. Appreciate it. Those are the words.